She was invisible until the moment she fell and someone finally saw her. For years, Claire Whitmore worked in the shadows of a prestigious architecture firm. She showed up early, stayed late, and asked for nothing in return. She wasn't the kind of woman people remembered in office parties or even noticed when she disappeared. But one rainy night, an accident in a dark storage room changed everything. In that quiet, cold moment, bruised and alone, Claire faced something far more painful than a broken shoulder. She realized no one would have come looking for her. What would you do if you spent your life making sure others succeeded, only to be treated like you never existed? This is not just a story about an unexpected connection with a powerful man. It's about the quiet strength it takes to rebuild from silence, to choose dignity over gossip, and to finally believe that you matter. If you've ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or simply tired of being the quiet one, this story might be for you. Leave a comment if Claire's story resonates with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real human stories. Now, let's begin. With the woman at the corner desk. She was always the last one to leave, and no one noticed until the night she couldn't stand back up. The office lights hummed softly, casting a pale glow across the open floor. Most of the building had long emptied out. Desks sat in silence, screens dark, coffee mugs left half-washed in the break room sink. On the far side of the floor, tucked behind a half wall of old filing cabinets, Claire Whitmore sat at her desk still typing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She never had. But there was something steady in her that didn't allow her to leave things half done, even if no one would notice. Outside, the Oregon sky had turned to deep gray. Rain brushed gently against the windows, soft, persistent, familiar, the kind of rain that made people hurry home. Claire didn't hurry. She rarely did. At 36, Claire had long mastered the art of staying out of the spotlight. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't join the gossip by the coffee machine, and rarely left her desk for lunch. Her clothes were modest, simple, no loud colors, no sharp cuts, just clean lines, soft fabrics, and shoes that didn't click too loudly on the tile floor. Most people at Ellison and Marlowe knew her name, but few knew much else. She was just there. Reliable. Invisible in the way quiet women often are. She paused, reaching for her tea cold again. She didn't mind. The document in front of her needed careful review. A vendor contract with too many clauses and not enough commas. She adjusted her glasses, the faintest pinch at her temples, reminding her she needed a new prescription, maybe next month or the one after. In the kitchenette, the microwave beeped faintly as she reheated a small container of soup, chicken and wild rice. From the freezer section, store brand. It was warm enough, familiar enough, and she could eat it quickly at her desk while still working. She settled back into her chair and opened a second window on her monitor. The draft email to the finance team blinked, unfinished. She picked up her spoon, paused, and smiled faintly at the smell. It reminded her of quiet Sundays in her mother's kitchen, back when life had more company and less silence. She took a sip and leaned back slightly, letting her eyes rest. The hum of the building wrapped around her, the fluorescent lights above her buzzing in slow rhythm. Her apartment waited for her, but it wasn't in a rush either. A one-bedroom near the river, with peeling paint and an old radiator that clanked at night. She liked the sound. It kept the silence company. No one was there to ask if she'd be late. No pets, no partner. Her last relationship, her marriage had ended quietly, much like the way she moved through life now. A mutual drifting apart that had become final, with a signature and 2 sets of keys dropped in a bowl. No one at the office had ever asked about it. She hadn't offered. It had been 3 years. And the only real evidence of that chapter now was a small scar on her left ring finger where a ring used to be. Claire finished her soup and wiped her spoon before slipping it back into her drawer. She checked the time, 8:17 p.m. Her eyes scanned her to-do list once more. Most of it was complete. She was about to shut down when something tugged at the back of her mind. There was a folder, a physical one, marked Read Building, Structural Notes. It had been referenced in a call earlier that day, but the scanned version in the shared drive was missing 2 pages. The originals, if they still existed, would be in the archive room on the top floor. She'd meant to check earlier, but had been pulled into a staff update meeting about software changes. One of those sessions where she sat quietly in the back and took notes no one read. Claire sighed softly and reached for her sweater. The building's upper floors were always colder after hours, and the archive room didn't have a working vent. She slipped on her rain jacket, grabbed her small flashlight part habit, part preparedness, and slid her access card into her coat pocket. She stood for a moment beside her desk, looking down at the to-do list she had just crossed off. One more task, just a quick one, then home. She picked up her office keys from the hook, turned off her monitor, and began walking toward the stairwell. The hallway lights were dimmed. Motion sensors flickered on as she passed. Everything was still, as if the building itself had exhaled after a long day. She placed her hand on the cool metal railing and began climbing the stairs, one slow step at a time. The 5th floor passed, then the 6th. With each level, the sounds of the lower office faded into stillness. When she reached the top, she stopped to catch her breath. The door to the archive room was slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently. It creaked, of course. Everything up here creaked. Claire stepped inside, and the room greeted her with its familiar scent paper, dust, and the faintest hint of something like cedar. She clicked on her flashlight. Rows of shelves stood like silent sentries, boxes stacked high with yellowed labels, handwritten and curling at the corners. Her eyes scanned for the label she needed. She knew exactly where it should be. Just a few steps in. 3rd shelf from the top. She moved forward, unaware that in the next few minutes, everything she thought she knew about her place in the world, how unnoticed she was, how alone she felt, was about to shift. It wasn't the fall that scared her. It was the silence afterward. The archive room always held a chill, no matter the season. Claire's breath came in small, visible clouds as she stepped further inside, the faint beam of her flashlight cutting through the dim. Shadows stretched long across the rows of metal shelving, stacked high with boxes that hadn't been touched in years. She moved with practiced familiarity. This wasn't her first time up here. She'd been the unofficial keeper of lost paperwork for years now, the one who always knew where to find the version from 07, the original copy with red ink notes, the blueprint with the smudge in the corner that meant something important. She'd made herself useful in ways no one kept track of. The box she needed was where it had always been, top shelf, 4th row back. She found it quickly. Her flashlight bounced slightly as she looked up, noting the tilt of the metal shelf, just high enough to be out of reach. She pressed her lips together and looked around. The old folding step stool leaned against the wall like an afterthought. She pulled it over and tested it gently with her foot. One of the rubber feet had worn smooth, and it wobbled just a little when her weight shifted, but it would have to do. She climbed up slowly, one hand gripping the shelf for balance, the other holding the flashlight under her chin. The beam danced as she reached upward, her fingers brushing the edge of the box. A little farther. She stretched, just a little more, and then movement. The stool shifted, just an inch, just enough. Claire felt her balance tilt. Her arm jerked back instinctively, grabbing for air. The flashlight slipped from her chin, clattering against the metal shelf as it fell. Her foot slid. The stool tipped, and Claire went down hard. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Her shoulder hit first, then her hip, then her head grazed the cold concrete floor with a dull thud. The room spun briefly before settling into a blur. For a long moment, there was nothing. No pain, just a strange emptiness. Then sensation returned hot, sharp, unrelenting. Her left shoulder pulsed with pain, so intense it turned her stomach. She gasped, trying to sit up, but the movement sent another wave through her chest and down her back. Her glasses had landed a few feet away. One lens cracked clean down the center. Without them, the room blurred into soft edges and flickers of light from the fallen flashlight. Its beam now angled upward into the air. Claire lay still. It wasn't just the pain, it was the silence. The realization that no one was coming, that she could lie here, hurt, scared, and the world below would keep turning. Unbothered. The building had long emptied out. She hadn't told anyone she was staying late. Again, somewhere below. The hum of the emergency lighting system pulsed gently. But up here, it was just her, and the echo of her breathing. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the pain, through the ache that radiated from her shoulder to her collarbone. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, 10 minutes, maybe 20. Then, faintly, footsteps. Claire opened her eyes. The sound was distant at first, heavy, purposeful, coming closer. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. Still, she turned her head toward the hallway, blinking against the overhead light. The footsteps stopped just outside the archive room door. And then, hello, a man's voice, deep, cautious. She swallowed hard. "In here," she managed to say, barely louder than a breath. The door opened fully, and the hallway light spilled in. A tall figure stood in the frame, backlit broad shoulders, dark coat, silver at the temples. It took her a second to register the face, the voice, Grant Ellison, CEO, founder, the name on every plaque in the building. The man she'd seen 1,000 times from afar and never once spoken to directly. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on her form sprawled near the shelves. In 3 steps, he was beside her. Claire. His voice was low but urgent. "What happened?" She blinked up at him, cheeks burning with equal parts pain and mortification. "I fell," she said softly. He knelt beside her, one knee pressed against the cold concrete. "Where does it hurt?" She gestured weakly toward her left shoulder. It's bad." He nodded, studying the angle of her arm without touching it. "Don't move. We'll get help." She saw him reach into his coat pocket, pull out his phone, but then pause. His eyes returned to hers. "Can you walk?" Claire hesitated. "Maybe, if you help me?" He didn't hesitate. One hand slipped carefully behind her back. The other supported her arm. His grip was firm, but gentle, steady. As she rose, the pain roared back, but she bit down and nodded through it. He didn't rush her, just waited. They made their way slowly toward the door. Her breath came in short bursts. Each step echoed off the concrete and steel. Her head spun, but she kept moving. When they reached the elevator, Grant reached for the button, then glanced down at her. Concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "I was just grabbing something I forgot," he said, almost sheepishly. "Didn't think I'd find anyone else up here." Claire gave a faint smile, tight with pain. Lucky timing. He looked at her more closely then, as if truly seeing her for the first time, and then, quietly, he said, "Let's get you to someone who knows shoulders better than architects." She never imagined she'd be in his car, or that he'd drive like he actually cared. The rain had picked up by the time they stepped out into the night. Not a storm, just that quiet, persistent kind of drizzle that Oregon seemed to have perfected. The kind that soaked through slowly and smelled like cold pavement, wet pine, and a kind of loneliness that lingered long after the clouds cleared. Claire winced as Grant helped her into the passenger seat of his car. The pain in her shoulder pulsed with every movement, but it was manageable now, dulled by adrenaline, or maybe by the surrealness of it all. This wasn't how her night was supposed to go, and yet here she was, in the sleek black sedan of the company's founder, rain drumming gently on the roof, the scent of leather and cedar wrapping around her like something impossibly far from her life. Grant settled into the driver's seat with calm precision. His coat was damp at the shoulders, his hair slightly tousled from the wind. He didn't look like the man she saw during board meetings or in hallway portraits. He looked real, human. "Local clinic's about 10 minutes from here," he said, glancing toward her with quiet concern. "It's not fancy, but they're good people." Claire nodded, her fingers curled in her lap. "Thank you. I didn't mean to. You don't have to explain," he said gently. "Eyes on the road now. I've nearly broken my neck up there twice. That stool should have been thrown out years ago. His tone was dry, but not unkind, just enough to ease the tension in the car. They rode in silence for a minute or two, the windshield wipers moving in steady rhythm. The city blurred past in wet reflections, storefronts glowing, headlights smeared across the slick pavement. Claire tried not to focus on how odd this all felt, how close they were in the quiet cabin, how careful he had been, helping her down the stairs, how natural it all seemed. "You were working late," he said, breaking the silence. Claire nodded. "I wanted to finish a report before morning." "You always do that, only when it's important." He gave a small hum of approval, not a patronizing sound, more like recognition, like something had clicked. "I've seen your name a lot," he said. "Never realized how much you handle until last quarter's review. You're one of the reasons that place stays standing." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, surprised by the compliment, more so by the sincerity in his voice. "Most people don't notice," she said, quieter than she meant to. Grant glanced at her briefly, then looked back to the road. "That's a failure on our part, not yours." She didn't know how to respond to that. The rest of the drive passed in gentle quiet. He didn't fill the silence unnecessarily. He didn't pry. He just drove, safely, steadily, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. When they pulled into the small parking lot of the neighborhood clinic, he turned off the engine and got out quickly to open her door. Claire tried to protest. She wasn't helpless, but her shoulder ached too badly to argue. Inside, the waiting room was nearly empty. A woman with a sleeping child in her arms sat near the window. An older man read a gardening magazine in silence. The air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly floral, cheap air freshener. "Maybe," Claire checked in, wincing as she wrote her name with her right hand. Then she turned to Grant. "You really don't have to stay," she said, her voice low. He raised an eyebrow. "I brought you here. I'm not about to leave you stranded. I can call a cab when I'm done." He shook his head, already settling into one of the stiff plastic chairs. "I'll wait." There was no fanfare in his tone, no implication, just fact. Claire sat beside him, unsure where to put her hands. She glanced sideways once or twice, but he seemed content reading a framed print on the opposite wall, something about community health initiatives. 45 minutes passed. The nurse finally called her name, and Claire rose slowly, her arm pressed close to her side. Grant stood as well, but she held up her hand. "I'll be okay," she said. "You don't have to come back." His eyes met hers, steady. "I'll be here." She nodded once and turned toward the exam room, unsure why her heart was beating faster. The doctor was kind, efficient. She examined Claire's shoulder, did a few gentle rotations, and confirmed what Claire suspected, a bad sprain. No breaks, a sling for support, ice packs, rest, no heavy lifting for at least a week, the doctor said with a small smile. That includes ambitious filing cabinets. Claire chuckled, despite the pain. When she emerged back into the waiting area, Grant stood up immediately, all set. She held up the blue sling. "I'll live. Glad to hear it." They walked back out to the car in silence. The rain had softened to mist now, glistening on the pavement like tiny stars. Claire slid into the seat carefully, cradling her arm. She expected him to drive off right away, but instead, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her without a word. The card inside was simple, cream-colored, handwritten. "You matter more than you realize." Claire stared at the words, her fingers brushing the ink. She didn't speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because everything inside her felt too full to name. When they reached her apartment, she stepped out slowly, turned toward him, and offered a soft, "Thank you." He only nodded. She watched his car pull away, the red taillights melting into the fog. In small offices, silence is rare, but whispers, they spread like wildfire. The morning Claire returned to work, the sky was unusually clear for November. Sunlight stretched timidly across the sidewalks, drying yesterday's rain in slow streaks on the office windows. She carried a small bouquet in one hand, white daisies, soft and a little imperfect, wrapped in plain brown paper. It wasn't much, just something she'd picked up from the corner shop on her walk-in. A thank you to herself, in a way, a quiet promise that she was still here. Her shoulder ached gently inside the sling, a dull reminder with every step. But she moved with care, keeping her spine straight, her expression unreadable. Years of practice made that part easy. As she stepped off the elevator, she felt the first flicker of change. It was in the way conversation dipped a little too suddenly when she entered the administrative floor, the way two women at the printer exchanged glances that lasted a beat too long, the way Deborah Madsen, senior assistant and queen of all unspoken rules, gave her a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Claire offered polite nods, placed the daisies in an old ceramic cup at her desk, and powered up her computer. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't, not anymore. She could feel it, this invisible shift in the room's temperature. Not cold, exactly, just watchful. The kind of atmosphere that settled in places where people had already made up their minds. At first, she tried to ignore it, told herself she was imagining things. The injury had left her sore, sensitive. Surely no one cared enough to talk. But by noon, the pattern was impossible to miss. In the break room, she caught the tail end of a sentence, of all people. By the elevators, must be nice to have that kind of attention. And near the copier, a whisper that carried more weight than volume, just 3 words. She's not subtle. Claire kept her face calm, her hands steady. But something inside her nodded slowly, tightly, like a thread pulling at a seam she thought had long been mended. She'd spent most of her adult life staying quiet, keeping to herself, doing the work others didn't want, without complaint, never pushing, never needing the spotlight, and yet, here she was, center stage for a drama she never auditioned for. It didn't take long for the whispers to gain shape. People talked about how she left late, how she was the one Grant Ellison personally drove to the clinic, how no one else had ever received a handwritten note from the CEO, let alone flowers. Claire almost laughed at that one. The daisies had been her own. But rumors don't need facts, just air and repetition. Deborah passed her desk later that day, stopping just long enough to peer at the flowers. "They're lovely," she said. "A gift." Claire glanced up. "No, just something I picked up." Deborah's smile tightened. "Ah, for a moment, I thought Mr. Ellison had added florals to his personal style." She walked off without waiting for a reply. Claire sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keyboard. Her shoulder throbbed, but it wasn't the pain that made her chest feel tight. It was the weight of it all, words unspoken, judgments already cast, and the quiet erosion of dignity. Later that afternoon, she stayed late again, habit more than obligation. The floor was mostly empty. Light pooled in long rectangles across the carpet. Somewhere, a vacuum hummed faintly. Claire rose to refill her tea and paused near the copy room, where the walls didn't quite reach the ceiling. The voices inside were muffled, but not enough. I'm telling you, she knows exactly what she's doing. She's been around long enough to play the game. A laugh, soft, cruel. She's not exactly the intern anymore. Maybe she figured it was time to aim higher. Claire didn't move, didn't breathe. She didn't need names. The tone was enough. Her tea went cold on the counter. She didn't go back for it. Instead, she sat at her desk and stared at the daisies, now beginning to wilt at the edges. Just 2 days old and already fading, like everything else. Her hand hovered over the mouse for a moment, then moved deliberately. She opened her email, clicked on a draft she'd started months ago but never sent. It was titled Department Transfer Inquiry. She had never meant to use it, just something she'd written once on a hard day. But now, the words on the screen didn't feel dramatic. They felt necessary. She updated the date, typed a single line at the bottom. I believe a quieter environment would be more suitable at this time. Then, without letting herself hesitate, she hit send. Sometimes we choose silence, and sometimes we retreat to it. The elevator doors creaked open to a level most employees rarely thought about. Basement B, unmarked on the glossy directories near reception, but very real to those assigned there. Claire stepped out, her flats clicking softly against the concrete floor. The air was colder than she expected, with a faint metallic tang, like old coins and damp paper. Her new office wasn't an office at all. It was a desk wedged between filing cabinets and floor-to-ceiling shelves that held the forgotten lifeblood of the company permits from decades past. Zoning applications, expired contracts, architectural blueprints with curled edges and dust in their folds. There were no windows, no natural light, just the hum of fluorescent tubes and the muffled clatter of the HVAC above. A single space heater rested under her desk, though it did little more than warm her shins. Claire placed her canvas tote down gently. The shoulder strap tugged at her injury still sore, though less so now. Her sling was gone, but the stiffness lingered, a quiet echo of what had changed. She took a slow breath. It smelled of old paper and something faintly antiseptic. She wasn't sure what she had expected. The records department staff worked in silence, heads bent toward spreadsheets and logbooks. There was no music, no idle chat. Most people didn't even look up as she passed. Only Ben, round-faced and quiet, gave her a nod and pointed to the desk prepared for her. No welcome, no judgment, just space. In a way, it was a relief. There were no whispers down here, no curious glances, no half-smiles hiding sharpened thoughts. Here, she could just work. Her days took on a rhythm quickly. She'd arrive early, often the first one through the basement doors. She'd make herself a cup of coffee in the break nook, a space shared with cleaning supplies and a vending machine that groaned when it worked. Then she'd settle into the task of organizing archival files, logging data into the outdated system, creating order from years of disorder. The quiet was both comforting and stifling. She didn't miss the stares from upstairs, but sometimes, when the fluorescent lights flickered just slightly and her fingers ached from typing, she found herself missing something she couldn't name. Maybe it was the warmth of natural light. Maybe it was knowing someone saw her. Maybe it was him. Claire didn't allow herself to think about Grant too often. Not while she worked. Not while she filed away permits from 1997 or read contractor correspondence in faded ink. But sometimes, in the lull between tasks, her mind wandered to the car ride in the rain, to his hand on the small of her back, steady and respectful, to the handwritten note, to the way he'd said, "You matter more than you realize." She hadn't replied. What could she have said? He was the CEO of a firm with over 200 employees, and she was, well, someone who had needed help and, in the aftermath, had become a headline without a story. Still, something in her had shifted. She felt it most at night, in the stillness of her apartment, when the only sound was the refrigerator hum and the ticking of the clock her mother had left her. It was during one of those nights, 4 days after she moved to the basement, that she found the package. It was waiting on her desk one morning, wrapped in thick brown paper, no label or postage, just her name, written in a precise, almost old-fashioned hand. Claire hesitated, looked around. No one else seemed to notice it, or maybe they did, and just didn't care. She sat down slowly and peeled away the paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, deep chestnut in color, soft as worn gloves. Her name was embossed in small gold letters, Claire Whitmore. It took her a moment to breathe. She opened the cover. On the inside page, in the same steady handwriting, was a single line, "Silence is where the truth finds you. G." She didn't need to guess who G was. The word struck her in a place she had kept walled off for years. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, it was something quieter and, somehow, deeper. A message from someone who saw her, not just as a file clerk or a secretary or a temporary fascination, but as a person, someone who had worth outside of what others believed or whispered. She ran her fingers gently across the embossed letters, then closed the journal and held it against her chest. She hadn't written anything personal in years. Not since before the divorce. Her ex-husband had once told her journaling was childish, like writing love letters to yourself. Eventually, she'd stopped. But this wasn't a notebook. It was an invitation. That night, Claire brewed herself chamomile tea, turned off the television, and sat at her tiny kitchen table. The journal lay in front of her, closed but waiting. She opened to the first page after Grant's note, picked up a pen, and let her hand hover. It wasn't easy, but then again, healing never is. She began to write not about him, not about work, not even about the fall. She wrote about silence, about how easy it was to fade when no one looked for you, about the ache of being polite when you wanted to scream, about the comfort of order and the chaos underneath it. She wrote until the tea went cold and the streetlights flickered outside, and when she finally stopped, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, steady, seen. Before she lost her voice, she had once loved writing, and now, the words were returning. The first page she filled was hesitant, like dipping her toes into water she'd once feared would drown her. Claire's handwriting had changed since the last time she journaled. It was smaller now, tighter, like it didn't want to take up too much space. But the words came anyway. She started with the simple things, the way the basement smelled in the early morning, the click of her keyboard echoing against the cement walls, the rhythm of Ben's footsteps as he paced between cabinets, and then something deeper. She wrote about the silence she'd chosen, and the one that had been forced on her, about the way grief sometimes settled not like a storm, but like fog, soft, slow, and everywhere. She wrote about her mother, about the gentle way she used to braid Claire's hair on school mornings, humming old country songs off-key, about the smell of lavender and newspaper ink, because her mother read the Sunday paper from front to back while sipping tea she never quite finished. Claire hadn't written about her mother since the funeral, 5 years ago. She'd packed those memories into a mental box, labeled it too much, and tucked it on the highest shelf in her mind. But now, the pages welcomed them like long-lost friends. Each morning before work, and each evening before bed, Claire opened the journal. It became part of her, a ritual that soothed the ache beneath her quiet exterior. No one else knew. There was something sacred about that. She wrote about small, forgotten things. The sound of crickets outside her childhood window. The embarrassment of tripping on stage in the 3rd grade. The way her ex-husband used to leave the room mid-sentence, and how, for a long time, she thought that meant her stories weren't worth finishing. But slowly, steadily, the writing stitched her back together. And in between those memories, Grant began to appear. At first, just a mention. The way he handed me the tea without asking what I liked. How he stood by the door like a friend, not a boss. Then longer entries. She wrote about how he never interrupted, about the quiet way he held space for her pain, without trying to fix it or name it. She wrote not about a CEO, but about a man who remembered to bring a second umbrella, who didn't look at her injury with pity, but with concern that felt real. Claire didn't dare read those pages again after writing them, but she didn't tear them out either. They were part of her story now. As the days passed, something changed in Claire's posture. She still kept her head down, still worked diligently in the records department, but the weight on her shoulders had shifted. The stares and whispers from upstairs felt farther away now, like echoes from a world she no longer lived in. She no longer flinched when Deborah passed by her in the hallway. She no longer felt the need to defend herself against conversations she wasn't invited into. Because she had something none of them had. She had pages full of her, and for the first time in years, she liked the sound of her own thoughts. One Wednesday afternoon, as the clock neared noon, Claire stood up from her desk, stretched her stiff legs, and closed her journal gently. She placed it in her bag, along with her half-eaten sandwich. Instead of heading to the break room like usual, she walked toward the elevator. She hesitated for a moment in front of the metal doors, fingers tightening around the strap of her tote. Then she pressed the button marked L, Lobby. She had no plan. No destination? She just needed air. The upper levels of the firm felt different now. Louder, yes, but brighter too. The sun filtered in through tall glass windows, casting wide golden stripes across the hardwood floors. There were plants up here, and the distant hum of conversation. Claire didn't stop to greet anyone. She walked slowly, passing rows of cubicles and sleek offices, letting her eyes take in the familiar unfamiliar. She didn't realize how much she'd missed this, the presence of life above ground, the smell of brewed coffee and the gentle rustle of papers, a world moving forward. She made it all the way to the glass wall overlooking the small courtyard. It was empty at that hour, just a stone bench and some late summer hydrangeas blooming against the brick wall. Claire stood there for a while, letting the sun warm her through the glass. Her reflection looked softer than she remembered, less tired, less afraid, and the next day, she came back. Every lunch break, she took that elevator up, sometimes just to walk, sometimes to sit with a book, once, to stand in the hallway outside the library on the executive floor and watch the city unfold through the wide windows. She never ran into Grant. Or maybe she did, and he chose to give her space. Either way, she was grateful. This wasn't about being seen, not anymore. It was about choosing not to hide. Sometimes, the most important documents sit in the darkest corners, waiting for someone to remember. The air outside the meeting room was heavier than usual, thick with tension, quiet with the kind of silence that only precedes something breaking. Claire hadn't meant to stop. She had only wandered up, like she had the past few days, finding comfort in the sunlit halls. But today, there had been voices sharp, urgent, and a name that tugged at something buried in her memory. Marlow Heights Redevelopment. She hadn't heard that name in weeks, not since before the fall, not since the night everything changed. She moved closer, staying just outside the frosted glass door. The voices were muffled but clear enough. Structural load assumptions are off by 12%. If the city's audit confirms it, we'll lose the permit. That's millions down the drain. Claire's breath caught that number, that phrase. She had seen this before. Not now, but then. A Friday evening. A file folder with loose pages. A note she'd scrawled hastily on a yellow post-it and tucked into her journal for later. Check floor 3 calculations. Too high for foundation specs. Her journal, the one that now carried bits and pieces of her mind, like breadcrumbs leading back to parts she thought she'd lost. Back in the basement, she dug through her tote bag with shaking hands, past her lunch container, the small pack of tissues, the pen she liked with the soft rubber grip, then finally the leather journal. She flipped pages frantically, not the entries about her mother, not the pages about Grant. Further back, deeper, there it was, a diagram sketch, notes written in slanted print. If elevation load isn't recalculated, permit will fail inspection. She remembered it now, the day before her accident. She had stayed late to review updated schematics from one of the junior architects. Something hadn't felt right about the numbers on page 14, so she'd run her own calculations, quietly, the way she always did. But then came the fall, the injury, the gossip, the transfer, the hiding. She'd never submitted the revision memo, and no one else had caught the mistake. Claire sat still for a long moment, the journal open in her lap. She thought about what might happen if she said nothing, about the whispers that might return, the sideways glances, the accusations of trying to play hero. But she also thought about the workers on that construction site, the residents who would one day walk those halls, the people who trusted that buildings don't collapse. And Grant, he had told her, in that quiet way of his, "You matter more than you realize." Maybe it was time she started believing it, too. The elevator ride to the executive floor was fast, but her heart beat slower, focused, steady. Claire walked past the receptionist, past the art-lined hallway, until she stood once more outside the meeting room, the same one she had hovered outside just minutes ago. From behind the door, she heard raised voices again. Grant's among them. "We can't present this to the city unless we're absolutely sure. If someone doesn't own this mistake, we lose the deal." She took a breath, then knocked. Silence fell on the other side. The door opened a moment later. A tall man in a navy suit blinked in confusion. Behind him, the long conference table was filled. Executives, project leads, consultants, all mid-discussion, all now staring at her. Grant looked up from his notes. His brow furrowed slightly, but his voice was calm. Claire, she stepped inside, her journal clutched tightly. I think I can help, she said quietly, but clearly, there's something I need to show you. A few people exchanged glances. Someone coughed, but Grant didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the empty seat nearest the screen. Claire sat down, opened her journal, and flipped to the sketch with the notes. She turned it so it faced the table. This was from my review before my accident, she began. I flagged the load discrepancy in the Marlow Heights schematics. It's not in the official file because I never submitted it, but the numbers were off. She pointed to her handwritten correction. If we fix this line of calculation, the permit should hold. It'll need re-verification, but it's salvageable. There was a long pause. Then, one of the senior engineers leaned forward, took out his phone calculator, tapped furiously. After a few seconds, he looked up. She's right, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. This lines up exactly with what the city flagged. A quiet wave passed through the room. Not quite relief, but recognition. Claire felt her shoulders relax, not fully, but enough to breathe. Grant was still looking at her, but something in his expression had shifted. Pride, maybe something softer. He cleared his throat. Can you help us repackage the revisions if we submit them by this afternoon? We might still make Friday's audit. Claire nodded. I kept the draft on my old hard drive. If I can access it, I'll have a clean version ready in a few hours. Grant gave a small smile. Then let's get started. She had stayed quiet for too long, but now her silence carried weight. For most of her life, Claire had been the kind of person who made herself smaller so others could feel bigger. She kept her voice soft in meetings. She typed gently. She walked lightly. She blended into corners and stayed behind when the lights dimmed. But now, as she stood before the long mahogany table on the top floor of Ellison and Marlowe, her voice carried, not because she raised it, but because every word she spoke was lined with clarity, with purpose, with something deeper than confidence conviction. She walked them through the numbers, page by page. The error, as she had outlined in her journal, came from a misalignment in the structural load assumptions on the third floor of the Marlow Heights redevelopment project. A decimal misplaced, a unit conversion overlooked. Small mistakes, but stacked together, they compromised the entire design. Claire explained how she had recalculated the figures late one Friday evening, preparing a correction memo she never got the chance to submit. She pointed to the margin notes in her leather-bound journal, not elegant, not polished, but real and accurate. Every set of eyes in the room followed her finger as it moved across the ink on the page. No one interrupted, not because they weren't skeptical, but because somehow they weren't. At the far end of the table, the director of structural engineering, a man named Paul Treadwell with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for dismissing junior input, leaned back and crossed his arms. She's got it nailed, he finally said, his tone flat but respectful. She caught what none of us did. If these adjustments are correct, and they are, we can still submit an amended load assessment before the compliance deadline. The room murmured softly, a buzz of agreement, heads nodded, pens scribbled, but Claire wasn't listening to them. She was looking at Grant. He hadn't spoken a word since she started, hadn't asked a single question, but his eyes, those steel-gray eyes, hadn't left her once. Not when she opened the journal, not when she pulled out the calculations, not when her voice trembled slightly on the word omission. It was the kind of attention that didn't feel heavy or inspecting. It felt seen. Claire tried not to let it rattle her, but there was a heat rising behind her ribs, something that hadn't been there before. Pride, maybe even something like belonging. When she finished, she closed the journal slowly. I'll prepare a formal correction packet by the end of the day, she said, her tone quiet but steady. If we send it to the city before tomorrow noon, we have a chance to retain the bid. No one moved, then Grant stood. He didn't look at anyone but her. She just saved us millions, he said, voice low but resolute. His words sliced through the quiet like a clean break in glass. Maybe it's time we listen more. The room shifted, not literally, but perceptibly, as if the power dynamic had realigned by a degree. Somewhere. Claire heard the soft shuffle of someone uncrossing their arms, the way one of the newer associates, a woman in a beige blazer, gave a nod that felt like gratitude. No one applauded, but somehow, the silence was louder than any clapping could have been. It was the silence of recognition, of recalibration. Claire stood still, not sure if she should thank him, or nod, or say anything. But maybe there were moments when silence did more than words ever could. She simply met Grant's gaze, and he held it, long enough to say something without speaking. I see you. I've seen you all along. After the meeting adjourned, she stepped aside as the others filed out, their eyes softer than before, their footsteps quieter. A few offered polite nods. One even paused and said, "Good catch," and it didn't feel patronizing. It felt earned. As she gathered her journal and slid it back into her tote, she felt Grant approach beside her. He didn't say anything right away, just stood, hands in his pockets, as if choosing his words carefully. "You didn't have to speak up," he said at last, "but you did." Claire turned slightly, her shoulders still sore but her spine straighter than ever. "I didn't want the silence to win," she replied softly. Grant's smile was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was real. They didn't walk out together. That might have felt too much. But as she exited the room and stepped back into the hall, Claire felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not vindicated, not admired, but heard. And there was a difference. KTM Mach NI sang PHN 9. That afternoon, a folded note was slipped under her office door. One line, in his handwriting, "I have something I want to show you. Friday, by the lake." And Claire smiled. Not because she knew what it meant, but because for once she didn't need to. Some confessions are loud. Others come in the quiet space between two people. The cafe by the lake had barely changed in 20 years. Peeling paint on the window frames. A rusted bell above the door that jingled lazily. The smell of old pine and stronger coffee. Claire had passed it dozens of times since moving to the town, but she'd never gone in. Not until now. Grant was already there when she arrived. He sat at a table near the window, where the view opened out to the still water, dotted with the faint shimmer of late afternoon sun. No laptop, no phone, just a mug between his hands and something unspoken in his eyes. Claire hesitated in the doorway, not because she didn't want to go in, but because somewhere deep inside she knew this wasn't just coffee. It was something that had been building between them from the night she fell in that storage room. She took a breath and stepped inside. He stood when he saw her, pulled out her chair. She smiled, a little unsure of what to do with the gesture. When they sat, there were a few seconds of silence, not the awkward kind, but the thoughtful kind. The kind that came when words didn't want to rush and ruin the moment. "You came," Grant finally said, voice soft. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I know," he replied, gently. "But I'm glad you did." They talked about everything but the thing that mattered, at least at first. About how the rain hadn't come back in 2 weeks. About the heron she saw on the bridge that morning. About a bakery that used to sit on this very street decades ago. It was easy. Too easy. And Claire knew that easy could sometimes be a shield. She set down her cup. "Why did you ask me here?" Grant, she asked, not unkindly. He looked out toward the lake. His jaw moved slightly, like he was rolling the words in his mouth before letting them go. "I wanted to see you," he said. "Outside the office, outside, all of it." She didn't answer right away. Let the truth settle between them. He continued, "I don't have speeches or perfect timing, and I'm not sure how this should sound, but I know that when I don't see you for a day, it feels like something's missing. Claire looked down at her hands, her fingers curled slightly around the ceramic of her mug. I'm scared, she said, barely above a whisper. Grant leaned in, but didn't interrupt. I'm scared of what people say, of what they assume. I'm scared of being wrong. Again. Her voice cracked at that last word. Again. He heard it, all of it, and still. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. I built my life small on purpose. Claire continued. So that if it collapsed, it wouldn't hurt as much. But lately, she stopped. What he asked, gently. Lately, I feel like I've outgrown the walls I built. There was a long pause after that. Outside the window, the water stirred slightly in the breeze. Grant spoke quietly. I've been afraid too. Claire, for years, of risking something real, of losing control, of not being enough. He looked at her, then not with pity, not even with hope, but with understanding. I'm more afraid, he said slowly, of never knowing what this could be. There were no flowers, no music swelled, no grand declarations, just two people sitting at a chipped table in a lakeside cafe, slowly lowering their shields. Claire met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look away. Maybe, she said, voice steadier than she expected. We both deserve to find out. Grant didn't smile immediately, but something softened in his face, like tension loosening after a storm. He reached across the table not to hold her hand, not yet, just to rest his fingers lightly against the side of her cup. Enough to say, I'm here. We don't have to rush, but we're not alone anymore. They sat like that for a while. The cafe around them blurred into quiet hums and clinks of spoons. Outside, the lake held the fading sun like a secret it didn't want to let go. Claire didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but for once, that didn't terrify her. Because sometimes, the scariest thing wasn't being hurt. It was never letting yourself be known. KTM Mo Kien I sang PHN 10. As they stood to leave, Grant held the door open for her. Just before she stepped through, he said softly, You still have that journal? Claire nodded. Then maybe it's time we started writing a new chapter. She didn't go back to who she was. She moved forward to someone new. The basement was still cold in the mornings, still too quiet, still filled with the scent of aging paper and metal shelves that creaked when no one touched them. But something had shifted, not in the room, in Claire. She still arrived early, still brought her own coffee in a ceramic travel mug with a small chip on the rim. But now, instead of going straight to her desk, she made one stop first. A corkboard, once blank, now carried a pinned sheet of paper titled The People Who Keep Us Going, an internal memoir from the corner desk. Each week, Claire would add a new story, not about herself, but about the quiet ones, the file clerk who biked to work in rain and snow, the janitor who left origami birds in the supply closets, the receptionist who always remembered who liked one sugar or none. And people began to read them, then forward them, then tape them up near elevators, coffee machines, and cubicle walls. She didn't put her name on the pieces. She signed each one simply from the corner desk. One day, Claire sent a printed copy of the latest story about the woman in HR who baked for everyone's birthdays but never had anyone bake for hers to Grant's office. She slipped it into a manila envelope. No post-it note, no message, just the words and the initials on the last line. And she didn't expect anything back. Not really. Her workdays became a steady rhythm. Write in the morning, file in the afternoon, smile more easily now when passing coworkers said hello. Even Deborah, who once led the whispers, had softened. Last week, she'd stopped Claire by the stairs and said, I read your piece about Eddie in the mailroom. You made me cry? Claire smiled at that. Not because she had made someone cry, but because it meant someone was feeling something real. She still wrote in her leather-bound journal, the one Grant had given her. the one that now lived in the top drawer of her desk. Its pages were nearly full. There were no margins left, no blank spaces to hide behind, but the scent of cedar still lingered faintly on the cover. Whenever Claire opened it, she breathed in, and it reminded her of something she never thought she'd rediscover: possibility. She hadn't seen Grant much in the past few weeks. They'd agreed not to force anything, to let the silence settle before they filled it again. But every once in a while, she'd catch him in the hallway, or hear his voice echo briefly from a meeting upstairs. And each time, there was something unspoken in the air, not avoidance, not tension, but a kind of waiting, like a book left open, face down, on a table. Then, one Thursday, Claire opened her mailbox in the break room. Inside was a simple cream-colored envelope. No return address, just her name, written in bold blue ink, the kind of ink that stained a person's thumb. She sat down at the nearest table before opening it. Her heart beat faster than she liked. Inside was a short note. Handwritten, still up for coffee. This time, I won't take no for an answer. Gee, she stared at the words for a long time. Not because she didn't know her answer, but because she realized, suddenly, how far she'd come. From the woman who used to eat cold soup alone, to the woman who could walk into a room of executives and speak her truth, to someone who had once believed she was invisible and now found herself seen. Claire stood, folded the note carefully, and tucked it into the back of her journal, not to hide it, but to keep it close. She walked to her desk, opened a fresh document on her screen, and began to type. They called her the quiet one. But silence doesn't mean absence, and some voices are made not to shout, but to carry. She paused, smiling, then saved the file. That evening, she left the office just as the sun dipped low. Grant was waiting across the street, leaning against his car, not in a suit, but in a navy sweater and jeans. He looked up as she crossed toward him, and his face broke into a grin that was part relief, part disbelief. "You came," he said, echoing the words he once spoke in a cafe. Claire nodded. "I was never not coming." She replied, "They didn't talk about the past, not about the gossip, not about the fall, not even about the journal, because some stories don't need retelling, they need living." They drove with the windows cracked, the fall air crisp, no music, just the steady hum of the tires, and the warmth of knowing they weren't driving alone. Back at her apartment later that night, Claire lit a candle. The scent cedar, and something sweet filled the room. She opened the journal one last time. On the final page, she wrote, "I was never broken, just waiting to be read." Then she closed the cover. Not because the story was over, but because she was finally ready to begin a new one. Sometimes, the strongest people are the quietest ones. They show up every day, do the work, carry the weight without asking for applause. They go unnoticed, not because they lack worth, but because the world often overlooks the soft voices and steady hands that hold it together. Claire's story is a gentle reminder that being invisible is not the same as being unimportant. And even when the world seems too loud, too fast, too blind to see us, there are people who notice, people who care. It also reminds us that healing isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it's a journal with your name on it, a walk upstairs, a conversation over coffee, and the courage to speak, even when your voice shakes. If you've ever felt forgotten, or like your story wasn't worth telling, remember this. The smallest acts of kindness can reach the deepest parts of someone's loneliness. And sometimes, a second chance doesn't come crashing in. It whispers quietly, with the scent of cedar, and waits for you to say yes. You still matter. You always did. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If Claire's story touched your heart, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing for more stories that remind us of the quiet strength we all carry. Your support means the world and helps us keep telling the stories that matter.